In 1984, a teenager called Alexander Scott got his tabletop RPG published by Puffin Books. This was an imprint that was also responsible for the Fighting Fantasy game books, but his game, Maelstrom, was a very different beast. From its inception, Maelstrom was intended to be used as a fully featured, if rules light, game, and in a fairly unusual, not to say inexplicable, setting. In theory, the game's universe was supposed to be Tudor England, approximately. Though there were some fairly significant departures from any historical context that would make sense. For one thing, guns, though theoretically present in the game, were in practice not considered despite their prevalence at the time the game is set. Now, for the boys from the Baltic Star, this wouldn't pose much of a problem. After all, we've always favoured forearms over firearms on this channel. But this is still worth mentioning in case you're expecting the capacity to play in a faithfully realised representation of the time. In a more historical sense, the type of Tudor life that was represented was, to coin a term, rather grimdark, violent, repressive, usually fairly unpleasant. Now, obviously, to a modern eye, that's probably very fair. But it misses for me a sense of context, which is that we would despise an era of religious persecution, entrenched class warfare, incompetent or corrupt law enforcement, and the constant fear of death through intent or misadventure. We would hate it. But for the characters living it, this was the best things had ever been. And next week would be even better. I mean, someone was about to bring potatoes from across the pond. This sense that things, uncomfortable as they might be, were still advancing steadily, is less well captured by the rules and setting details, because it does rather revel in the countless miseries of the time. None of this is a problem, of course. I'm merely suggesting that if you play Maelstrom in its original setting, you might want to think about including a character or two with a moderately optimistic outlook. If not, you allow the characters to perceive their situation as if they were aware of a world where people are sitting comfortably in front of a laptop, munching on crisps and dry roasted peanuts. Well, it might rob them of some verisimilitude. The rules had a few interesting concepts, though not strictly original in every sense, and horrifically relied on percentile dice. For those naive souls who don't know that term, it's a sort of cover phrase to disguise the fact that the D10, my least favourite die, was going to make repeated appearances, usually in pairs. Each character is classed based on the concept of a living. Essentially, the trade or occupation that the character possesses. This is very reminiscent of the service careers in Traveller, and even more closely aligned with the slightly modified array of careers in Mongoose 2nd edition Traveller. For me, this aspect felt a little underdeveloped at the time, but others may reasonably disagree, of course. There's another thing that I think could have used some thought. The characters are defined using a set of 9 basic characteristics, which is both far too many for a rules-light system and far too few given that all the talents a character possesses are intended to be described in this way. I think that part of the mechanics could certainly be massively simplified without losing any of the role-playing experience. The game is set in an era with a politically powerful church, so though there was magic in the game, it was a secret, with its practitioners being forced to hide their talents. After all, you don't want to be inquisitioned. A serious dose of inquisitioning could ruin your entire afternoon. Anyway, on to the meat of the game, and I promise this part's going to be much more positive about the game. Much, much more positive. Magic, in the game, is considered an untamed force known as the Maelstrom, which seems too convenient to be coincidental, and one that can, if an effect is failed, cause terrible consequences for the spellcaster. So, you take Tudor England, delete firearms, insert magic, job done. Well, not quite. You see, Maelstrom had a few quite neat concepts that appealed to me at the time and still do today. Firstly, The rules allowed various ways of healing, buffing, or nerfing characters, and they were cleverly based on herbal concoctions. These days, that sort of thing might be more commonly found in a video game RPG. Think of it as a form of crafting. It was a nifty sort of idea and it worked well. The mechanics were that at certain times of year you could go and search for the relevant herbs that were in season, then prepare them into useful medicine, a process that often took weeks. You could purchase either the fresh or prepared herbs from traders as well, and it was fairly common in the game for players to arrange for their characters to carry various custom concoctions with a mixture of effects. Speaking of injury and healing, the system handled wounds in parallel. So each injury a character took was individually tracked, and each healed independently of the others, rather than a general health pool that restored at a fixed rate. In fact, healing from a relatively minor wound could take a long time in Maelstrom. It could become a significant factor in the time taken to reach your destination, on a long journey at least. Now, while actual magic, was rather shoehorned into the game, it did have a very interesting way of representing the casting of spells, which suited the canonical chaos magic of the Maelstrom, as well as limiting the complexity and sheer size of magic rules. To put it really simply, there were no lists of spells with complex and detailed effects. Instead, a mage could attempt to do literally anything. But the difficulty of that being accomplished was graded on a scale of 1 to 5, derived from the concept of how impossible it was. In other words, something that was actually quite likely to happen, like the chap who's threatening you with a sword slipping in the mud, would be ranked with a difficulty of 1 or 2, while if you wanted something truly impossible to happen, like fireballs flying from your fingers, then that would be a difficulty of 5. Simultaneously, this bypasses the need for huge lists of spells, encourages creative ways to make a spell easier by manoeuvring an enemy into doing half the work for you, and encourages the use of spells in a subtle, discreet way, as implied by the canonical universe. That's a really clever mechanic. In fact, if I can make a little confession here, when I was a mere child, I freely and frequently stole this single mechanic from Maelstrom to add on to any set of usable wargames rules to create endless variations on the theme of monsters attack, but set during the Napoleonic Wars, for example. These one-shots were a source of all sorts of games. I played games based on soldiers versus dragons, or the like, set in at least half a dozen wargaming eras. In fact, I recall a game based on a Vietnam War era small unit game called Body Count, with a zombie horde rising from the ruins of a village faced down by a mixture of US soldiers, a local priest, some NVA prisoners and a journalist. I recall that one proved to be a great success. Literally, take a set of wargames rules, add in Maelstrom's simple and effective supernatural components, make the whole thing into a creeping horror story, and remember to pierce the film lid several times, give it a shake, and voila, instant, memorable RPG. You're welcome. Oh yes, there's another little favour I can do at this point. In practice, when playing the game, it became hard for a player to estimate exactly how difficult a bit of magic might be to pull off. I mean, the player might think something was a level 1, but the GM might think that's a level 3. Now, this is a problem for planning out your actions. You don't know how easy or hard things are going to be. So accordingly, we implemented a sort of house rule, which I'm going to describe here. Instead of trying to quantify 4 levels of unlikelihood before you get to impossibility, I went with just 2. In essence, things that were really fairly likely, such as an enemy slipping in the mud, would be a 2, while things that were possible but really lucky, like finding someone had left a sword on the ground when you were in dire need of a weapon, those would be a 4. Then if you, the player this time, could come up with a tool, device, trick or some other narrative option, especially if it was either cool or funny, you could get those 2 dropped by a level. So if you threw the contents of your canteen on the muddy ground in the hope that your foe would slip, for example, then something that was already decently plausible would now be rated as even more likely. The additional water would make the foe slipping a level 1 challenge, so notably easier. Informally speaking, ideas that were clever, cool and funny were eminently welcome. For me, this is a classic situation in which the player's narrative and imaginative skills define and drive the story, letting the mechanics of the game do their thing, but never at the expense of role-playing. It's far from the only example of this, to be sure. But this is one of the first times I remember deliberately adapting a rule to suit the game at the table, where, if you were designing a computer game, you might have come up with an extremely complicated point system to calculate the appropriate difficulty. The original book was published as a simple paperback, though it looked really classy because this was the era when publishers had discovered how to add shiny foil elements to book covers, and Maelstrom was an early example of this. I'm delighted to report that the game still has a small but enthusiastic following, and in the process of digging out my old copy, I went looking for any sign of current life in the community. And guess what? There are more than a dozen official or semi-official PDFs of rules and explanations, and expansion sets, though I can't really speak to their quality because I've only ever had the original rulebook. I may be doing something of a disservice to the game's development, however, when I point out that the later expansions seem to move the game in a less interesting direction. Well, some of them at least. There are expansions to add in more explicit fantasy options and monsters from the fantasy canon. In reality, I'd be tempted to double down on the historical elements, even to the extent of removing magic entirely, despite its imaginative mechanic, if that was helpful to the setting. There is an expansion that moves the action to ancient Rome, something that's much more enticing to me, and an expansion for mid-19th century Gothic settings. Again, that's more like it. These still retain the magical elements, something rather beneficial in a Gothic environment and presumably optional in an ancient setting, but ultimately the clean, simple mechanics and the relatively light rules are likely to make Maelstrom a sensible choice for the framework of many settings that might be of interest. Essentially any period from cavemen to cavaliers would be compatible, and this allows the easy setting of the game in high medieval, Renaissance, ancient, Native American, quite a lot of human history. I mean, at the moment, Luke's playing through a video game called Hellblade. In fact, he's just finished it, which is set a bit loosely in the era of Viking raids, Britons and Anglo-Saxons. If I wanted to run a tabletop RPG of the same era, then I'd probably begin by looking at Maelstrom. It allows the incorporation of significant supernatural elements into an otherwise very light and quite rational game. I'd just limit the number of characteristics a bit. Oh, and that herbalist crafting mechanic? You can easily repurpose it into a crafting mechanic for swordsmiths, farriers, stonemasons, and anything else that you might need. I suggest this even though there are already rules for craftsmen in the game, because the lavish and interesting crafting instructions are mostly limited to the herbalist, while armourers and the like get much less entertaining options. And of course, if the mashup game you're assembling lacks any suitable character generation rules for RPGs, which might be true for both wargame rules and random extension rules that people often make for other RPG systems, remember that Maelstrom's character gen, while old-fashioned, is easy to follow, and in a simple wargame adaptation there's actually a benefit to the way the character's performance is limited entirely to the character's stats. It makes for fast character creation and immersion. But, and this is just a thought, you could steal the character stats from Fighting Fantasy, bulk up the numbers, especially the stamina score, make a simple matrix of how much the character's living impacts the capacity to carry out things like persuasion and perception, and then add one more skill number for intellectual rather than physical skills. I mean, right? If at the same time you remove the need for D10s, well, clearly you stand upon the path of righteousness, and none may gainsay you. I think next time we're going to take a look at a much more genre-specific rule set for those who want a more immersive experience when dealing with things that not everyone might be all that familiar with. I might also explain what I've got against 10-sided dice. Until then, Maelstrom. It's really interesting, and at least as inspiration, really useful.